very happy to introduce Joyce Fingland, who's going to be talking to us today. Joyce is an ex-IT expert from the Limestone District School Board, and she has always been interested in family history, but took it up in earnest in 2002 when her husband George, his uncle, died, and she wrote a book to share all the information that they found in his property. She wrote a book about the Finglands of Addington Farm, and that was it. She was hooked. And so now she is the editor for, let me get these names right, Newsleaf, which is the Ontario Genealogical Society's magazine, and Families, which is their journal. So she's a real family history expert now. And she was also the chair of the Kingston branch of the OGS in the past. And she's written 2 further books since the one on the Finglands, one about the Rideau, Seasons on the Rideau, and one called Our Family, which you said was about 400 pages long. Anyway, so I'll shut up now and pass you over to Joyce.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amanda.
Is your thing on? Oh, yes, it is.
I think I turned it on.
Yes, you did. The light's on it.
Okay. So, Deseronto and the Rathbunds, pretty inseparable in some respects, but not the whole story. So, the number one question is, why Canada? The Rathbunds were Americans. Why were they opening this big business in Canada? So I'm going to give you a little bit of history. Canada had enjoyed a preferential trade arrangement with Britain up until the repeal of the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws were designed to ensure that the poor had cheaper grain, but they were repealed in 1846. Britain had been cut off from its supply of timber in the Baltic by the Napoleonic Wars and was importing large amounts from British North America, mostly from Quebec and the Maritimes, although some came from the Ottawa Valley. In 1841, timber exports to Britain constituted 2/3 of all of the exports coming out of what we now think of as Canada. Britain, going through the Industrial Revolution, could not get enough of British North American lumber products. Wood for shipbuilding, house construction, and railway ties were the 3 main areas of demand in both Britain and in British North America. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain regained access to the lumber from the Baltic states and needed to trade more with its neighbors in order to sell the products of industry. Why would they continue buying lumber from Canada? Meanwhile, in 1840, the Canadian government had become concerned about the growing export to the US of fresh-cut timber. Same story as we've got today. Should we ship the crude or should we refine it here? US sources of timber in New York and Massachusetts had been largely exhausted, and they were interested in Canada's raw materials. In 1854, the Americans signed the Reciprocity Treaty. Grain, timber, coal, and potatoes could all enter the large American market duty-free for the next 10 years in exchange for American fishers being allowed to ply their trade off the Grand Banks. So then the next question is, why Deseronto? Location, location, location. That lumber was all being moved by water. Here's Deseronto, protected bay, but easy access to Lake Ontario, straight across to Oswego, all these rivers feeding into the Bay of Quinte, could go up the Rideau if they wanted, up the St. Lawrence to Montreal, perfect location. So down here we've got the Erie Canal, and when it was first built, they deliberately bypassed Lake Ontario because they wanted everything, the people who were behind it wanted stuff to come from Lake Erie and Lake Huron. But people wanted the goods from the other side of Lake Ontario. So they built this Oswego connection, and it was super profitable. So when the Rathbunds started business in Deseronto, straight across the lake to Oswego, down to the Erie Canal, off to New York City and the Atlantic Ocean. Perfect. So a little background on the Rathbun family. And this is an image of the Rathbun crest. And there's more than one spelling of the word Rathbun, as there are for most names. They were long established in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts. They traced their ancestry to one John Rathbone, who was born in 1629 or 1639, depending on which source you consult. He was born in Hough Green, Ditton, Lancashire, England, and he emigrated in 1654, died 1702, Rhode Island. John Rathbun and his wife Margaret Akers were among the first purchasers of land on Block Island, and one of 7 families to move to the island in 1661. So 2 friends of mine, Edward and Elizabeth Kipp, who are members of the Ottawa branch of the Ontario Genealogical Society. Ed is a direct descendant of that John Rathbun. So they went to a Rathbun family reunion, and he wrote about it for the newsletter. So I fired him off an email when I read his write-up and said, you know about the Rathbun connection to Deseronto, right? And he says, well, a little bit, but not very much. Would you like to write an article for the newsletter? So thus begun this project. The line of the Rathbun family that we are interested in is that of Edward Rathbun, born 1776, and Anna Fuller, who had 8 sons in Scipio, New York, near Auburn. One son, George, born 1802, became a U.S. congressman. Amos Scott Rathbun, born 1810, was son number 6, and Hugo Burkhart Rathbun was son number 7. So Amos Scott Rathbun first investigated the possibility of establishing a sawmill at what was then known as Culbertson's Wharf in 1840, and opened the mill in 1848. Hugo, who'd been working with his brother, bought the business along with 2 partners in 1849, but the company was headquartered in Auburn, New York. Amos opened the mill in 1848. So now we've got Hugo as ownership, and Hugo had married Louisa Storm, daughter of Isaac T. Storm, a senior partner in the prestigious Manhattan firm of East India merchants, Storm, Smith and Company. So he soon added a grist mill and a general store. In 1856, he bought out his partners and he moved his family to what was then called Mill Point, and they became Canadian residents. Hugo's son, Edward Wilkes Rathbun, joined his father in the company at the age of 20 or 21. But prior to coming to Deseronto, he'd already spent some time with his maternal grandfather in New York City. He knew something about global trade. He became the driving force of company and town success. So here's a painting of the early mill. I'm sorry it isn't showing up quite as well as we would have liked. These are timber marks that were registered to Hugh Rathbun and his son, Edward Wilkes, in 1870. Kind of like brand marks for cattle. And when you think about how they were moving the logs on the river, they'd want to mark them. Whose were whose. They needed barges and tugs to move their goods to market. They needed ways of getting their finished goods to market. How were they going to do that? They bought boats. They bought a whole fleet. So then they added a shipyard. They added docks. They added storage facilities in Deseronto and Oswego. It grew naturally. The Deseronto Navigation Company was set up to ensure that the company products were moved to market rapidly with minimal cost. There's the dock from the top of the office, looking across to what became Forester's Island. And boats were used for moving people regularly from up and down Lake Ontario. Kingston was a major port. They needed railways. Water didn't go everywhere. And eventually, you're cutting the trees near the water. They get a little further away, you're going to need rail to move them. So they began running a railway. They began building rolling stock and locomotives. And then they decided, well, we could sell rolling stock and locomotives to other people too. So here's some photos from the archives here with some of the shots of the railway. Even streetcars. The Grand Trunk Railway. Originally they started out, all they needed to do was connect Desiranto to the Grand Trunk Railway 4 miles away. But it grew. And the thought was you're going to try to tap into all the mineral resources further north, further west, build more railway, get involved. So they had a total of 8 sawmills, 2 in Desiranto, 2 in Gravenhurst, 1 each in Lindsay, Campbellford, Fenland Falls, and Bancroft. They also had iron ore smelting, a terracotta works. Terracotta had the advantage of being fireproof, as described in a company sales catalog titled Terracotta Fireproofing Material, manufactured by the Rathbun Company, Desiranto. They had a cedar mill to supply poles for the burgeoning electric and phone networks. They had munitions, a charcoal works, street lighting, a roller process flour mill that was the first of its kind, banking, including a company script, a newspaper, and a telephone system. They were at the leading edge, or as we would now say, perhaps bleeding edge of technology even then. For example, the telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell, 26th of June, 1874. The Bell Telephone Company was incorporated 29th of April, 1880. The first 2 phones leased to the Rathbun Company in Mill Point, 10th of May, 1880. 2 weeks hasn't gone by. So one of the things, Matthew Butler, the talented young engineer, son of Rathbun employee since 1850, Tobias Butler, was sent to Germany to determine the closely guarded process to produce Portland cement, a little industrial espionage. Matthew returned with the formula using marl and clay as the principal ingredients. Marl was readily available in Marlbank, which was now accessible by the new Napanee, Tamworth, and Quebec Railway. So they had Portland cement factories. So this is an ad from the Toronto Daily Star, dated May 26, 1900. The Canadian Portland Cement Company Incorporated, with capital of $1.5 million, was offering $200,000 worth of preferred stock for sale. So maybe that doesn't sound like that much, but I'm pretty sure that in 1900 that was a lot of money. There's the Napanee cement plant. Waste not, want not. The road to riches. What made Edward Wilkes Rathbun so successful was his ability to turn every potential waste item into a new money-making product. Every scrap could be used for something, if only to fuel the boilers. Lathe and picket operations produced broom handles, chair stretchers, blind slats, barrel headings. Match splints were made from the smallest waste. Illuminating gas was made from the sawdust. There was nothing that wasn't used. Now the photos tend to be the first decade of the 1900s, because that was when Harold Rathbun was busy taking photos. They weren't as common in 1860, and certainly not for outdoor casual photography. The shingle mill. Look at the stacks of material. And then you think about the potential for fires. Certainly laid out in front of one. And there's the smokestacks. And those boats, when they were underway, lots of smokestacks, embers flying from them too. The machine shop, the Desiranto Chemical Works. Maybe we're just as glad that isn't sitting on the bayfront today. The Sash and Door Factory. We're still putting nice windows in all of our houses these days. So when the town was incorporated, Edward Wilkes Rathbun was one of the early mayors. Besides that, he served as president of the Rathbun Company, the Canadian Portland Cement Company, the Bay of Quinte Railway, the Thousand Islands Railway, and the Deseronto Navigation Company. He was vice president of the Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company, a member of the Royal Commission on the Forests of Canada, a governor of the Kingston School of Mines, a trustee of Queen's University, and vice president of the Dominion Marine Association. Talk about energy. So, what about the Rathbun family? So Edward Wilkes' father, Hugo, and his wife Louisa Storm had 7 children altogether. They were Edward Wilkes, the one we've been talking about, born the 5th of October 1842 in Auburn, New York, and he married first Elizabeth Howe Burt. Elizabeth died in 1871, and Edward then married Benella McMurroch, 11th of June 1873. The next is Anna Louisa. She was born 1849 in Auburn. She married William Hindhoff of Oswego. Fanny Gertrude was born about 1854 in Auburn, New York. She married Reverend Robert John Craig, the 10th of April, 1878 in Deseronto. Frederick Sherwood was born about 1856 in Deseronto, shortly after they arrived. And he married Jean McMurroch, Benella's sister, the 31st of October, 1877 in Toronto. Then we have Louisa, born about 1860 in Deseronto. She married Edward Clement French, 22nd of October, 1884 in Deseronto. Herbert B., born about 1861 in Deseronto. He married Agnes Bell, 12th of February, 1884 in Belleville. And William Cullum B., born about 1865 in Deseronto, and he married Jean Blackie, 3rd November 1886 in Toronto. And you're totally confused. So on the back table there's a family tree chart. So who was involved in the company? Everybody. So Edward Wilkes Rathbun, the oldest son, he's the guy in charge. But Frederick Sherwood Rathbun became his brother's very capable assistant, and he was company treasurer and was president of the Oshawa Railway. Herbert B. Rathbun was the general superintendent of outside work in Deseronto. The youngest brother, William, was involved with the Olden Ranch, so presumably was looking after operations to the north. William Hindhoff, Anna's husband, was the company manager in Oswego. Fanny's husband, Reverend John Craig, was a Presbyterian minister. The company donated the land and Edward the funds for the Presbyterian Church of the Redeemer that still stands on St. George Street. Louisa's husband, Edward Clement French, was a chemist in charge of the chemical plant. Hugo died in 1886 at the age of 74, and his wife had died the year before. It had no effect on the company. It was all in the hands of their kids. So who worked for the Rathbun Company? By 1900, there were 5,000 residents in Deseronto. Not everybody worked for the Rathbuns, because you had the people who worked for the grocery store and the bank and everybody else. But think about this. Kingston, at the time of the 1901 census, was 1,800 people. Deseronto was roughly a third the size of Kingston. It tells you something about how important it was at the time. The company had 4,000 employees spread through much of the province and had operations in Oswego and had offices in Toronto, Montreal, and New York. Employees and their sons who performed well were promoted to greater responsibility. And they were well paid for the time, and they appeared to be happy with their situation. There was little turnover. The obituary collection on the archives here is worth checking whether you have people that work for the Rathbunds or not. I found some real gems there. So this is the one that caught my eye the very first. Doesn't take place in Deseronto. McKnight Samuel, 03/12/1897, drowned near Arden. Last Saturday, youngest son of Robert McKnight of Olden Township, about 3 miles from Arden, was drowned in a creek while skating. The boy, who was about 12 years of age, went out for a pail of water and ventured on the ice to skate. We'd never do that, would we, when we were 12? The ice broke, and soon he was struggling for life. His cries were heard by his father and others of the family. Mr. McKnight made every effort to save him, but could not get near enough. The funeral took place on Monday at Mountain Grove. Mr. McKnight at one time had charge of a farm on the reserve for the late H.B. Rathbun Sr., and he also managed the Olden Ranch for the late William Cullum Rathbun. His many Deseronto friends will sympathize with him in his great trouble. Excuse me. So, you know, that with them having offices in Toronto and Montreal, there's people from those places that show up in those obituaries. They're great. So Deseronto needed all of the merchants and services of any town. So here we have Bogart Brothers Grocery Store. How about a tailor? William Stoddart was born 8th of October 1841 in Scotland, where he married his wife, Margaret Home, and the first 3 of his children were born. They immigrated first to Simcoe County, where his youngest 2 children were born. They were Margaret, born the 20th of June 1874, and William, born the 20th of June 1876. William Sr. and his family moved to Deseronto prior to the 1891 census. In 1897, an obituary appeared in the Deseronto paper for his mother in Tranent, Scotland. Not where you'd think to look for her obituary. William the son married Frances Amelia Richardson, 8th of March 1899 in Napanee, and had 2 children. The younger, Nora Holmes Stoddart, we'll meet later. So this is the home he built on St. George Street. The small images is how it looked early on. The larger one is how it looked last summer. Lovely, and it's still a nice piece of property. And it's a few doors up from the Presbyterian Church. So who else found their way to Deseronto? Even retirees thought that Deseronto was a fine place to go. My husband's great-uncle, William George Fingland, moved from Camden 8 to Deseronto in September of 1918, as noted in the communion roll for Knox Presbyterian Church at Reedville. Deseronto was a going concern with an opera hall and 2 hotels. The same architect who designed Naylor's Theatre also designed the high school. Edward Wilkes Rathbun hoped that Deseronto would become a center of the arts and education as well as industry. So in addition to the Presbyterian Church built by Edward Wilkes Rathbun, there was a Catholic church, an Anglican church, a couple of views of that, or English church as this one's labeled,